This episode was brought to you in part through the patronage of Ariya Norinth, which is a damn cool thing to say. Thank you. 2018 marks the 30th anniversary of Die Hard, arguably one of, if not the, best action films ever made. So much so that Die Hard in a blank became the descriptor for a whole subgenre of action films. It's probably even still in use today. To celebrate this momentous occasion and the film itself, I thought it'd be cool if we went and looked at why Die Hard works as well as it does, and why so much of that goes back to the film's writing. And we're also going to take a look at a few fun facts, a few fun writing facts about Die Hard, including, did you know it was based on a book? Die Hard was released in 1988 and spawned a whole bevy of sequels, but it actually began life as a sequel itself to the 1968 film The Detective, starring Frank Sinatra and Lee Remick. That film was based on a 1966 novel of the same name by Roderick Thorp. And when the film became a hit, producers went back to Thorp and said to him, hey, if you ever write another one of these, let us know and we'll pick up the film rights. To which Thorp, as any smart writer would and should, said, hey, I'm working on one right now. He wrote a few other books in between the two books, but word has it, when he started developing the sequel full time, he was inspired by Richard Martin Stern's 1973 novel The Tower, which was partly the inspiration for the 1974 disaster film The Towering Inferno, a film that apparently gave Thorpe nightmares about some guys with guns chasing him through a skyscraper. And, after watching the film, I get it. I can totally see why you would get a nightmare from that film, especially back then. And especially, given O.J. Simpson is in it. But nightmares, hey, they make for some excellent, excellent author feel, believe me. And, it all worked out. He had a nightmare about being chased through skyscrapers. So what? That book that he ended up writing based on that nightmare got turned into Die Hard. So, yeah, I'm not feeling bad for him about a little nightmare. Now, don't get me wrong. Nothing Lasts Forever, the book that he ended up writing as a sequel, it is not literary magic. It is the kind of book that you pick up at your departure gate and you put down immediately after the wheels hit your tarmac, and you never even think about it again. You never pick it up again. You leave it in that loner library thing that is in some of the airports. So I don't want you thinking that Die Hard owes everything to this fantastic novel that happened to be churned out, because it's almost the exact opposite. Nothing Lasts Forever it's an ugly, ugly book. The main character, Joe Leland, he's just kind of hardest of hard asses, and he's just relentless. He doesn't really care about killing any of these people except maybe some of the women, but only that so much. He only maybe kind of second guesses those deaths a little bit. And the rest of the characters, they're not much better. Very, very few are redeeming, except maybe the one side character, Taco Bill, which is probably one of the best character names I've ever read in a book. I mean, seriously, it's right up there with Hannibal Lecter and Buckaroo Banzai. Even our cop friend, Al Powell, played oh so lovingly by Family Matters' Reginald VelJohnson in the film. Yes, he's in the book, but in this book, he literally throws another cop into the line of fire and reminds all the characters who saw it, said, hey, he died a hero. Yeah, he's not a good guy. Nobody in this book is really great. I mean, they're all just kind of dicks. Yeah. Really, it's kind of surprising how negative and pessimistic the whole book is. Nothing Lasts Forever. It's about an aging detective who really doesn't have much life left in him, who's thrown into this impossible situation. And you can see the core idea there was probably a good one. There was something special about it, but it was surrounded by all this stuff that just wasn't. But when it comes to making a great film, really, that core idea, if it's strong enough, that's really all you need. Whenever a book's adapted to film, a bunch of it is going to be left on the cutting room floor. And that's simply because books have a lot more room to tell a story. They have a lot more time to tell a story compared to a movie that's 2, maybe 3 hours long, or a television show that could be hours and hours long. For the record, Die Hard comes in at a suave 2 hours and 12 minutes. So, even supposing, let's suppose for a second that Nothing Lasts Forever was a fantastic book, which I'm not saying it was, there'd still be stuff to cut. For instance, Nothing Lasts Forever is entirely told from a third-person perspective, but it all follows the point of view of the main character, Joe Leland that I mentioned. So all you see throughout the book is what Joe Leland sees, what he hears, what he does, what he thinks. And to be frank, you can't do internal monologues, internal thoughts well on film unless you're going to do like a voiceover monologue, and voiceover monologues just never, ever work. Just, ask Harrison Ford about them.
There it was again. Feeling in myself for her.
That means when you're putting this movie together, you show rather than tell. You put in great visuals rather than suffocating narratives. And when writing Die Hard's script, Jeb Stewart and Stephen E. D'Souza, the two lead writers, they nailed this concept. Just check this very minor example from the very start of the film. Our hero, John, he's sitting there in the limo, right? He's giving his stone face, and our driver, Argyle, he's doing what all drivers roll over. I mean, he used to be a taxi driver, so it makes sense. He's trying to get John to talk, to chat. Except John doesn't want to. He especially doesn't want to talk about his estranged wife. And a conversation like that, that's just not going to be good film anyway. I mean, an action film where the lead character goes on about his marriage problems, that's good for a drama, like a movie over the bridges of Madison County, but in an action flick, no, that's just not going to cut it. But that information, however, it's not superfluous. It's not something that can be cut. It's integral to this movie. It's the motivation, it's the drive of our main character. So it has to be conveyed to audiences somehow. If you're not delivering this through a lengthy monologue, there are other ways to do it. Maybe you show divorce papers, or you have a bunch of scenes kind of dedicated to their tumultuous marriage. But that takes time. So there's, you can have that, but it's going to take you a while, and it's going to take up some of the film. So what did the Die Hard writers come up with? Well, they came up with a quip.
In other words, you thought she wasn't going to make it out here, and she'd come crawling on back to you, so why bother to pack, right?
To which our hero says,
like I said, you're very fast, Argyle.
That's all we need to know that the marriage is on the rocks and get a feel for how it's affecting our main character, that snappy, succinct dialogue. We don't need a long monologue or flashbacks or anything like that. Stuff that works really well in the book. Stuff that is in the book. Stewart and D'Souza found a way to extract that information and tell us everything that we need to know for the ensuing plot without overloading us with exposition and extraneous detail, while also serving our character's development. That wasn't the only way they took what Thorp wrote and fine-tuned it for film. Nothing Lasts Forever is a constant barrage of upped stakes and problem solving, which is exactly what Die Hard is also. Stewart and D'Souza found myriad ways to constantly make life harder for our protagonist. From McClane's feet getting destroyed to the FBI proving to only make his life harder, Hans figuring out Holly is McClane's wife, and even at the end, McClane only having 2 bullets left. Riveting. Now, ratcheting up the tension like that, upping the stakes constantly, that goes a long way, especially in an action film. But Die Hard isn't just an action film. It's a film with action. I make this point because of another smart choice that the writers did. They didn't just take scenes out, they added scenes. And that's, something that you have to do when you're adapting novels, because, especially if you're removing scenes, if you don't tell the whole story, audiences are going to feel it. And we're going to get to a bit of a point in Die Hard where it was felt that something was missing, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But, like I said earlier, Nothing Lasts Forever is told in a third-person perspective following the main character. So we only get to see what he sees or what he feels, what he thinks. And there's a lot we don't see. There's nothing from the perspective of the cops. which you'll know there's plenty of in the film. There's nothing from the perspective of the baddies either, which, again, includes some of the film's best scenes. And there's absolutely nothing from the hostages' perspectives. So all those scenes with Holly, there's no equivalent in the book. The key, though, is to not just put a scene there to throw a scene in there, or just so the actors have enough screen time. The scenes added to Die Hard, they're compelling. They're important to the story. They push the story forward. They also ensure every single character has something to do, some motivation, which you don't always get. Sometimes they're just flat characters who are just kind of there. Not in Die Hard's case. Heck, even the reporter has motivation. And, leads to one of the best ending scenes. I think I might be making it sound a lot easier than it is. Oh yeah, you take this book, you cut out all the fluff, you add a couple more pieces in to kind of flesh out the story and make it look good on film. It's not that easy. This is not something that happens every single day. This is a whole loaded process. And in Die Hard's case, all of these added scenes and the fact that they work probably and did happen a lot by accident. Because when they started filming, Bruce Willis was still acting, was still starring in the TV show Moonlighting, meaning he could only really film at night, and by the time he got on set, he had already finished filming a 10-hour set. D'Souza explained it like this in an interview with Slash Film. So after the first week, John McTiernan, the director, came to me and said, "We have at least another week of this overlap. Why don't you go back into the script and see if you can find more stuff for all the other characters to do?" I think it's safe to say adding in those scenes made for a far more nuanced tale, and added a bunch of character development to the film that is frankly just not present in the book because of its narrative structure. But there's one major change I think perfectly exemplifies how those making Die Hard, making the film, really knew what works in film and what works in books, and knew how to differentiate those. And it's probably one of the things that really makes Die Hard so special and makes it so enjoyable each and every time you view it. Remember what I said about Nothing Lasts Forever, that it's dark, that it's pessimistic, that it's not very fun? Well, the original script for Die Hard carried a lot of this over, including the book's chief antagonists, terrorists. And it led to John McTiernan, the director, the man who would eventually direct Die Hard, turned down the project more than once. Because, as he put it, he wouldn't agree to do the film until it, quote, had some fun in it. He told Empire magazine in 2014, "The original screenplay was a grim terrorist movie. On my second week working on it, I said, guys, there's no part of terrorism that's fun." He's right. Robbers are fun bad guys. Let's make this a date movie. There's still a great nod to this original antagonist, to the original book, in the fact that the robbers, as McTiernan calls them, masquerade as terrorists while they're pulling off their little heist. Multiple levels of deceit we'll talk a lot more about once we start talking about the perfection that is Hans Gruber. There were a few other changes from the book, including trimming the timeline down from 3 pages to 1, switching the bad guys from Japanese to Germans. But it's this one, switching up the bad guys from just kind of nameless terrorists to prolific robbers, that really strengthens the film and makes it stand out from the book, where the terrorists do little that is really memorable or noteworthy or will ever strike you as something important. To show you what I mean, let's just do a quick mind exercise, shall we? Imagine if Die Hard's antagonists were still terrorists, okay? That we had Hans, he's a terrorist, he's not trying to rob, he's not doing anything, he's just trying to kill some people or whatever. So that would kind of put them on par with, what, the bad guys from, like, Air Force One, right? That was another great action film, and Harrison Ford did a hell of a job as president. I would take him over the current president any day of the week. But who were the bad guys in that film? Can you name them? Can you name a single bad guy from that film? Oh, wait. Yeah, because I can't name a single one of them without going on to Google. And that's because they aren't characters. They weren't characters in that movie. They were just nameless bad guys. They were just filling a role. They were filling a plot device. I think Gary Oldman was one of them, but I'd rather watch Gary Oldman over in The Fifth Element than Air Force One any day of the week.
You're so wrong.
And if the writers of Die Hard had taken the bad guys from Nothing Lasts Forever, if they had stuck with the terrorists, if they had stuck with the same kind of motivations and not switched it up and not played with our expectations, I don't think Die Hard would be anywhere near as special as it is. And I don't think we would be sitting here celebrating its 30th anniversary, and you certainly wouldn't have this beautifully lovely video to watch. Food for thought right there, huh? All of these great changes, all of this excellence on paper, none of it matters if 1, you don't get the filming right, or 2, you don't have the right title. Well, they somehow managed to get both right, and because I'm not a film major and can't really comment on the importance of a Dutch angle or low angles or anything of that nature, why don't we talk number 2 for a bit, huh? Because it might surprise you to learn that when the script for what would inevitably be Die Hard, when that very first draft was submitted on June 24th, 1987, it was with the title, you guessed it, Nothing Lasts Forever. After all, when you're basing a script on a book, why would you change the title, right? Well, the second version, submitted October 2nd, 1987, had the new title on it. So, why the change? What happened in those 4 or so months? I mean, Thorp's first novel, The Detective, which Nothing Lasts Forever serves as a sequel to, that name didn't get switched up when it went to film. So why did this one? I mean, Nothing Lasts Forever may not be a perfectly roll-off-the-tongue kind of title. It may not be as extravagant, as kind of poignant as something like Die Hard, but I mean, it serves its purpose. It's not a bad title. It's pretty good. Well, for one, there was probably a push, at least a somewhat mild one, at the producer level to distance Die Hard from its predecessor, The Detective. After all, at that point, it was no longer a sequel to The Detective. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But if you're not actually creating the sequel to a film, why would you use the title of the book that serves as a sequel to the book that the first movie was based on? Is that logic there? I think that made sense. But there's a bigger, dare I say, funnier reason why Nothing Lasts Forever had its title changed. Because one of the producers, Larry Gordon, he apparently thought Nothing Lasts Forever sounded far more like a romance novel than it did an action movie. And honestly, I can't say I blame him. But Joel Silver, another producer for the film, and a name you probably recognize, he knew the exact title they needed for this script. Only problem, it was on another script, one written by Shane Black. Another name you should probably recognize, and if you don't, you gotta work on that. So, story goes, Joel Silver, he calls up Shane Black and he says, Shane, I need that title. I need Die Hard. And however that conversation goes, whether there was a threat, whether it was just begging, however, whoever became like the power position in that conversation, Shane Black eventually agreed. And he retitled his screenplay, and Joel Silver got the Die Hard title and changed Nothing Lasts Forever into Die Hard. And as they say, the rest is kind of history. And it truly is fitting, because John McClane, he is definitely a man who dies hard, right? Or I guess, he doesn't, because he doesn't die. Spoilers. Oh, and that screenplay, that was renamed The Last Boy Scout, which was known at the time for being the highest paid screenplay in history. Really unfortunate given the movie bombed. But I don't blame the screenplay. I haven't actually watched the movie, but I'm sure given it was written by Shane Black, it's not that bad. But it really had a garbage truck of a trailer, and that just did not help.
Bruce Willis, Damon Wayans, The Last Boy Scout.
But speaking of changing names, I mentioned earlier that Nothing Lasts Forever, the novel on which Die Hard is based, was a sequel to The Detective, which was adapted into a 1968 Frank Sinatra film. Well, when that film was being made, Sinatra apparently liked the script so much, he had it written into his contract that if a sequel ever got made, if there was ever anything where his character would return back to the screen, that he would have the right to first refusal. Meaning that, and you probably already realize where I'm going with this, when Nothing Lasts Forever, when Die Hard went into production, Frank Sinatra had the right to first refusal to star in the film. Yeah. Sinatra was 73 the year production started. Which that would have fit the novel, given Joe Leland in the novel. He's an older, he's more experienced, he's this wizened detective with years of combat under his belt, he's grizzled, he knows what he's doing, he has all this knowledge, he's been an expert, he's playing in all these different things. He's very much the kind of guy that, frankly, you kind of think of Frank Sinatra, and he's that guy. But it would have made for an entirely different movie than the one that we ended up getting. Well, as you can figure, he inevitably, although by all accounts very gracefully, turned the role down, and eventually Clint Eastwood picked up the rights and considered the main role for himself. He was about 50 at the time, but nothing came of that either. The role then got shopped around a bit. The film got shopped around a bit, including one little bit that seems to have become more myth than anything else, that the film was potentially going to be reworked as a sequel to the 1985 Arnold Schwarzenegger film Commando. Though that seems to be more of a rumor than anything else. Some people treat it as fact. It seems, from what I can tell, to be a rumor. Although it sounds pretty cool. Well, it would just end up being that thing where, the daughter got kidnapped again. She's in a high-rise instead of the jungle this time. Sequels. Like Kevin McAllister being lost in New York instead of locked at home. Home Alone, man. Good movie. We'll get back to Home Alone. Yeah, we will. But, yeah, pretty much every single leading man in Hollywood at the time was considered for Die Hard. That included Sylvester Stallone, Burt Reynolds, Al Pacino, Richard Gere, James Caan, and even Harrison Ford. This is about the point where the role changed dramatically, and we lost the original Joe Leland and ended up with John Ford. No, not the director, but the original name for the character that would inevitably be John McClane. Now, a quick note on that. I reached out to one of Die Hard's main writers, Stephen E. D'Souza, to ask him if he remembered where the name John McClane came from, because I could not find any information on the origins of that. And, when I'm coming up with a character's name, it's usually, let me dive into the baby registry, let me just look in the yellow pages or whatnot, let me figure out something, or maybe there's something that I have in my back pocket that I've been saving for a rainy day. I looked for any of that, could not find any information. So, yeah, I reached out to him on Twitter. He sent me an article in response that was in Spanish. Well, I had it translated and looked for the name, and the only little bit of information I could find on it was that he was originally called John Ford. I don't know why. I don't entirely know why they changed it, other than the fact that Ford is a very prolific name, and there are a lot of Fords throughout history, so there's, the name carries some weight with it, unlike McClane, which is sort of that unknown everyman kind of name. Like, nobody knows the name McClane, or they do now, but back then nobody knew the name McClane. So, whatever. We got this John Ford, this John McClane, and he's no longer this older guy. They reworked the script, they reworked the story. They're like, well, we don't need it to be a sequel to The Detective anymore. Let's try something new. So they kind of change it up. They say, well, let's look for a younger guy. And they inevitably narrow the pool down to Bruce Willis. Well, they narrow the pool down after everybody else jumps out of the pool. But Bruce Willis, he's an unknown. Nobody knows who he is. He is starring in one TV series, dramedy kind of thing called Moonlighting. He had 2 mediocre, at best, movies under his belt. It was a huge payday for Bruce Willis. And obviously a major shift in his career, going from this dramedy TV series to this action flick. You know, it was kind of like the Chris Pratt of the day. He went from Parks and Rec, this kind of chubby comedian guy, to Guardians of the Galaxy, and suddenly he's like, oh, he's going to be the next Indiana Jones, he's going to be everything. That's what happened with Bruce Willis back then. But, again, what makes his casting so brilliant is that he was a nobody. He could be the everyman that is John McClane. This flawed New York street cop that gets thrown into this impossible, dire situation, and one that he barely makes it out with his life. You know, he learns himself a few life lessons along the way, so it all kind of equals out. Compare that to Joe Leland, who's this, you know, he's experienced. He even knows the bad guy. He recognizes him by his voice in the book. You know, and he's as jaded as a jade scorpion. And what's more, his character doesn't grow. And he is absolutely, utterly destroyed by the plot of the book. Hey, there's even a chance he doesn't even make it out of the book. You kind of get the sense that he dies at the end of the book. Whether or not that is factual or not, I don't know. But Thorp never wrote a sequel to it, so it's possible. But Bruce Willis's John McClane, he's more complex. You know, he's more complicated, more faulty, more rebellious even. And he gets scared. He cries. He feels like a human. It's like if I got put in that situation, at least that's what I hope I would be like in that kind of situation. I'm not a New York street cop, so I'd probably just be, you know, cowering in the corner like Hans does at the end. And the writers did even more for his character than just kind of make him into a human, make him somebody that everyone can sort of relate to in a way. What they did was they married the external conflict happening around him, this terrorist robbery thing happening in Nakatomi Plaza, with his character's inner turmoil. The external plot directly impacts his internal conflict, and vice versa. And both are solved through the same series of events. Both of these things get a satisfying conclusion by the end of the film. That is, you know, the internal conflict is that he and his wife, Holly, are on the rope. Something, again, that we learned through Argyle. Good old Argyle. You know, before we dive into that, let's talk Holly for a moment. Not just because she's so integral to the movie, but because she's so different than what we get in the book. Don't get me wrong, the basis is still there. That commitment to the job, that's a very driving point of her character. But in Nothing Lasts Forever, there is nothing redeemable about her character. You know, I was saying that earlier, that there's really nothing redeemable about any of the characters. And Holly's character, she's not Holly in there. She is Miss Gennaro. She is Joe Leland's daughter in the book, not his estranged wife. But, you know, in the film, we see Ellis snort cocaine, right? We see he's interrupted in that. In the film, it's very obvious they're all snorting the cocaine, that she's sleeping with Ellis, that she's just doing whatever she can to climb that corporate ladder. And in the end, she ends up falling out the window with the bad guy. She dies. So she's never redeemed. Like, she doesn't have a story arc. She's not really a character. She's a plot device. With Holly, we get the exact opposite. Not only do we get that fantastic, metaphorical, kind of transformative scene where her watch is unclasped at the end. You might think I'm reaching there, but I assure you that is totally metaphorical. I don't care what anybody says. You argue all you want in the comments. Totally metaphorical. Transformative. But we also get to see Holly as a strong, no-nonsense, independent woman. And at a time, in an era that is only at best hiding the fact that everything is sexist in the world, especially within Hollywood, especially within high-end corporate transactions like we cover in this, that is saying a lot, that she is up there holding her own against all of the male characters. And she's not ever villainized for wanting a career. She's even praised as being a good mother. She's very much presented as being a good, welcoming, helpful mother. Heck, she even stands up to Hans a few times. And what's so perfect about Holly, at least in Die Hard, we're not going to talk the sequels right now because the sequels are a completely different beast. But at least in Die Hard, Holly is written not just as an equal to John McClane, but perhaps in many ways better than John McClane. After all, don't forget, John is the one who chose to stay behind in New York while Holly pursued her career. He's the one that said, oh, I've got paperwork on my desk, I can't just up and leave, while his family flew across the world. Yeah, so who's the better parent here? So, back to McClane. While getting together with Holly to celebrate Christmas with her and the kids and trying to play nice after the 6 months or so separation, he gets thrown to this. He gets just pushed into this situation. He gets thrown to the wolves, basically, in this just horrible situation. And it's only after he has conquered his internal conflict, after he's accepted Holly's choice to find a career, to explore her career, to climb that corporate ladder and do what she thinks is best for her and her family. It's only after he accepts that and he grows as a character that he is able to conquer the external conflict by realizing what it is that needs to be done and getting this kind of clarity of mind so he can finally see what is going on. It's the bathroom scene I'm talking about here, in case you didn't realize, where things look super doom and gloom, and McClane's in there pulling glass out of his feet, and he's just hit rock bottom, and he's just tearing up, and he's just drenched in blood, and he gives this beautiful monologue through the walkie-talkie. I want you to find my wife, he says to, our buddy cop there, our pal, our Powell, Al. Why does his name sound so familiar? I don't get it. I want you to tell her something. Tell her it took me a while to figure out what a jerk I've been, but that when things started to pan out for her, I should have been more supportive. And I just should have been behind her more. Tell her that she is the best thing that ever happened to a bum like me. She's heard me say, I love you 1,000 times. She's never heard me say, I'm sorry. To which Powell responds, you can tell her yourself. Just watch her ass and you'll make it. And we get, and this part, this is the clinch, this is the important part. I hope so, but that's up to the guy upstairs. Upstairs. Hans, you bastard. What were you doing? See, it's all through this doubt, this fear, this reconciliation that McClane is able to move forward, to conquer, to think clearly. So if it hadn't been for that external conflict, he wouldn't have found the solution to his internal conflict. And if he didn't find the solution to his internal conflict, he wouldn't have had the peace of mind to figure out the external conflict. Every plot intersects. Every bit of the story is organically woven together. McClane's character is organically woven into the plot. The plot and him are like at this tug of war for characterization. It's something that you rarely see in a movie, and it's right here in Die Hard. It's all woven together in this complex narrative that really, truly never, ever seems that complex, which is how the writers... the writers are so brilliant that they are able to make something so complicated so simple. I mean, even the catchphrase is woven in. When I say that line about Die Hard, you probably know the one I'm talking about.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Now, the yippee-ki-yay part, you might have realized this if you've watched the film, but that's obviously a reference to Roy Rogers. Probably a few songs of his, actually, like Get Along Little Dogies,
Whoopie-di-I-O, get along, little doggy,
and the Ballad of Pecos Bill.
So yippee-yi-yay, yippee-yi-o.
Basically, it's just a variation of a cowboy call of sorts, and it really has more to do with the general sound of the call than the words themselves, which you can kind of tell are a little bit interchangeable. For instance, in Die Hard's script, the actual line is written as yippee-yi-yay. Director John McTiernan apparently wanted to use yippee-ki-yay, but it was Bruce Willis who argued that the line should be yippee-ki-yay. They apparently filmed both yippee-ki-yay and yippee-ki-yay, and yippee-ki-yay won out. They just thought it was a better version, you know. Yippee-ki-yay, yippee-ki-yay, yippee-ki-yay. I really don't see any difference, but, who am I, right? Now, the line does more than simply address the Mr. Cowboy kind of insult that Hans throws at John McClane. It also manages this neat little feat in that it marries the traditional archetypal Western hero with the modern action film hero. It evokes the Roy Rogerses, the John Wayneses, but also the Arnold Schwarzeneggers, the Sylvester Stalloneses. And it drops Bruce Willis's John McClane right in the middle of them with his badass line. And it just makes his character instantly memorable. Remember, this is Bruce Willis's breakout role. This is his first major film. And he delivers this line that is basically his "I'll be back." It's an understandably iconic, surprisingly perfect, realistically vulgar line. And there happens to be a little debate about who actually came up with it. Stephen E. D'Souza says it was from him in an interview he did with Creative Screenwriting. But in a 2013 interview with Ryan Seacrest, Bruce Willis says it was his idea. He said,
I have to tell you, it was a throwaway. I was just trying to crack up the crew, and I never thought it was going to be allowed to stay in the film.
Whatever the truth is, the line would go on to be used in every single one of the Die Hard films. It would be voted one of the best lines in cinema history, and it would go down in pop culture history. And not even just for the actual version of the line, but also for the censored versions that sometimes appear on network television. Like the one that evokes the somewhat mysterious Mr. Falcon.
Yippee-ki-yay, Mr. Falcon.
You can be witty, relatable, and badass, but a hero is ever only as good as the villain who opposes him. Thankfully, Die Hard has one of the most iconic villains in cinema history. Hans Gruber, brought to life by the late, great Alan Rickman in, get this, his very first motion picture role. There are a bunch of reasons why Hans works so well as an antagonist here, as the opposite to McClane, as this person that we're not even entirely sure can be beaten, but we want beaten oh so badly. And a lot of these really boil down to his character. He's classy, he's sophisticated, he's obviously well educated, and perhaps most importantly, he's smart. And we're not just told this, like, there's not a guy spouting off like, oh yeah, he's like the smartest leader I've ever had. No, we are told this, and we are told this repeatedly throughout the entire film. It's really subtle in a lot of ways. The way he kind of just calls out the John Phillips suit, that Alexander speech of his, how he pieces everything together and comes up with the strategy kind of off the cuff, like shoot the glass.
Schieß dem Fenster. Shoot the glass.
Not everybody would have shot the glass, and then that was the blonde guy, whatever his name is. He looks at him and is like dumbfounded, like, why would I shoot the glass? Of course you shoot the glass, the guy's not wearing any shoes, but Hans is working on another level, and all of these scenarios make it obvious that he is in charge, that he can figure things out. He's not just another terrorist nobody. He's not this no-name robber. But the big one, the big character moment, comes about 3/4 of the way through the film. When we get that turn, that moment when the FBI thinks they're going to one-up and terrify Hans by cutting the power. And you realize, as a viewer, that his plan was entirely counting on that. That is how advanced his plan is, how cunning, how brilliant. But if that were it, it probably still wouldn't be enough to put Hans in that upper echelon of villainy. Okay, so the guy knows how to make a good plan. Sure. He can call on a suit. Okay, I can probably recognize a branded suit if I'm buying the same brand. It's not a big deal. But then we get when Hans met McClane.
Hi there.
A scene missing from the original screenplay and only added because the producers heard Rickman's American accent. And because they wanted the two characters to meet before the inevitable climax. But just like that, Hans sees McClane, sees him without his shoes on, puts two and two together, and adopts this persona, adopts this accent, and starts pretending to be this dude, Bill Clay, William Clay up on the board. But he adopts this persona, and you realize just how advanced he is, how prepared he is at all times. And you realize as a viewer that McClane doesn't realize who he's dealing with right here. He doesn't know that this is a bad guy, so it seems. And then McClane gives him a gun, and you're like sitting there screaming at him, like, what are you doing giving him a gun? Don't give him a gun, that's Hans. He's gonna... Why are you giving Hans a gun? Right? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Of course, if you're watching this video, you know that the gun is empty, right? It doesn't have any bullets in it. And if you didn't, again, well, spoilers. Don't be watching a movie, a show, an episode about Die Hard, dissecting Die Hard if you're not expecting some spoilers, right? But why doesn't the gun have any bullets? Was it just fortuitous planning? Was McClane working on a different level? Did he just guess well? Why would he give a potentially useful ally an empty, useless weapon? It's not a mistake. It's not happenstance. McClane, in that scene, knows that Hans is lying. He knows Hans is one of them. He knows this is a fact. He knows it. There's no dancing around it. He knows it. Now, let me explain how he knows it. When Die Hard started filming, the ending wasn't set in stone. So the script was being shot as it was written. They started shooting it from the beginning of the script straight through to the end. And so one of the early scenes that they shot, one of the early scenes that was in one of the earlier screenplays, had all of the terrorists, Hans and all of his men, synchronizing their watches. And that is key because in that scene we realize that all of them are wearing the same Tag Heuer watch. So the movie's going on, the movie's progressing, and eventually McClane kills his first terrorist. The one with the, ho ho ho, now I have a machine gun sweatshirt on. But McClane, before he sends the body down, he searches the body, and what does he happen to notice on the guy's wrist? That Tag Heuer watch. Which is also nice, it kind of gives a callback back to Ellis giving Holly the watch, and kind of gives an idea of why he happens to be noticing the watch. See, it's all integrated there. But, McClane's fighting these terrorists, and he's going about his business, and he just happens to keep noticing that these people are wearing this watch. And so when Hans and McClane meet up, you know what Hans is wearing, right? Yeah, you bet. So despite his smarts, despite his meticulous planning, despite the fact that he seems to come from this super hive of upscale villainy, Hans was beaten by this street cop who has a penchant for noticing the small things like everybody wearing the same watch. So Hans was just defeated by the fact that somebody forgot to buy a wristwatch, variety pack. You do remember all this from the movie, right? You remember all these scenes? No? Wonder why. Well, it's because all of those scenes were cut from the movie. Because of a last-minute idea that Stephen E. D'Souza had to have the robbers, the terrorists, whatever you want to call them, escape in an ambulance. And you see that ambulance later on in the film. It's that one that, Argyle drives a limo into. Even though the truck that they came in on was too small to fit the ambulance inside of it. A fact which apparently still haunts production designer Jackson Nagoya to this day. But the other problem with the ambulance scene, there was no ambulance scene in that initial watch synchronization scene. It wasn't there. So, unable to explain how this ambulance suddenly appeared out of nowhere, they had to cut that initial scene. Why they couldn't go back and just refilm it, I couldn't say. I mean, all of this information came out years after Die Hard was released. It came from Degovia, actually. He kind of spilled the beans and said this was something that happened and we had to cut it. I'm not saying that because I want to qualify the statement. It seems absolutely plausible, but I want to get the facts out there. D'Souza also put out another little tidbit about this script when he was writing it. I think it was in the same interview, but he said he wrote the script as if Hans were the protagonist. Now, that doesn't mean that Hans is the hero. Don't get me wrong. Hans is not the hero. McClane is very, very obviously our hero. But in this context, it means that Hans was basically the main character. He was our driving character. As D'Souza told Creative Screenwriting, it's Hans Gruber who plans the robbery. If he had not planned the robbery and put it together, Bruce Willis would have just gone to the party and reconciled, or not, with his wife. So Hans is the reason that we have a movie, and Hans is the reason why McClane evolves as a character, as a person, as a husband. And when you have such an enigmatic character actor such as Alan Rickman, I guess you just kind of go for it, right? Certainly they had to have gotten what they paid for. Keep in mind, again, this is his major motion picture debut, so they probably got him on the cheap. And if you don't think they got what they paid for, just look at the way he conveys that kind of raw sophistication and that downright just brutality, all without doing much. He's kind of like the Christopher Reeve of this generation, the way that Christopher Reeves would go from Clark Kent to Superman. Like, he does this. Alan Rickman does this with Hans. And he probably also has one of the best acted deaths on film. And that's because it wasn't really acted so much, it was real, actual fear on his face that you see in the movie. Because director John McTiernan decided to drop him earlier than Alan Rickman was told he would be dropped, because John McTiernan wanted that look on his face. And they nailed it with that very first take. Yeah, I would be scared too. And coupling it with that line from Paul Gleason's Dwayne T. Robinson, that
I hope that's not a hostage.
utter perfection. Oh, hats off to you guys. Which makes it something of a shame that is not the final confrontation. It's a bit marred by Carl's sudden appearance at the very end, his reappearance there. Even if that does give Powell a nice character beat, couldn't we have just left Carl dangling upstairs? And it's honestly, this is probably one of the only flaws, writing-wise and probably just movie-wise, in the entire film. And it's a crappy flaw, but I mean, God, there's so much good around it, so who cares? So we've got the hero, we've got the villain, we've got the catchphrase, the final ingredient, the other true star of the film. Well, no story is complete without the setting, right? And for Die Hard, we get a truly iconic one. The now infamous Nakatomi Plaza. If you think I'm being a little overdramatic and calling Nakatomi Plaza the third star or the other star, I don't want to, give grief to Holly Gennaro because she's super important. So we'll say the fourth star or so of this film. Just look at this little bit from the screenplay. Tilt down from one of the stars of this film, the well-lit, impressive, and spanking new Nakatomi building. And how about we take another look at the original movie poster? Front and center. It's even more prominent on the Japanese poster. And what's the 5-film Die Hard Blu-ray Anniversary Collection look like? Oh wow, would you look at that? Now, the setting in the book, Nothing Lasts Forever, the one that Die Hard's based on, it is nowhere near a star. It's called the Klaxon Building. Yeah, it's an oil company. Of course they're going to have a name like Klaxon. And it's described in the book as only this: a 40-story vertical column on Wilshire Boulevard. Quite generic, right? But for a film like Die Hard, for any kind of film, really, you can't just have some generic, lame location. The setting is a very important part of the film experience. It's what you see around the characters. So when you look at Nakatomi Plaza, you know what you're really looking at, right? Fox Plaza. A newly built 35-story tall glass and granite skyscraper in Century City, a business district in LA. It was designed by architects Scott Johnson and Bill Fain under the guidance of architect William Pereira. It's actually the last building that Pereira worked on before his death. And it'd go on to be the home of Ronald Reagan's office after he left the White House. Cool little note, they were filming Die Hard when Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, Fred Ryan, toured the building. So there were all like these little spent cartridges and like blown out walls and broken glass everywhere. And a Secret Service agent reportedly quipped, "Great, you just picked the building where there's been a movie made about how terrorists can blow it up." Yeah, I don't know if I would pick it as my office either if I was a former president. But for a movie, it makes sense. And it was actually production designer Jackson DeGovia's idea to use this building. There was this perfectly lovely tower, he said later in an interview with LA Taco. Quite striking, isolated enough. It wasn't lost in a forest. It was new, it was up to date, it looked exotic, and there were a lot of empty floors because it wasn't completely inhabited yet. Though from what I gather, Fox really didn't save anything on production costs by using their own building. They actually charged themselves rent to use this building. There were no tax write-offs here. They weren't trying to cover up any of the money, but they're paying themselves, which that's corporate world in a nutshell, right? And you got to figure it wasn't easy filming in a building that was about 75% occupied at the time. You can just imagine them filming in the skyscraper's elevator shaft, which they did. They actually filmed in the skyscraper's elevator shaft. Just imagine how that would have impacted the businesses there. I go to the second, third, fourth floor in my building at work, and there are people who use the elevator constantly. They just go from one floor to another in an elevator. 35-story, how many stories it was? Yeah, that would make an impact on business. And even with them mostly filming at night, John McTiernan had to apologize to a whole bunch of people who were there working late at night, apologizing for, gunshots and explosions and all this fun stuff. I wouldn't mind. That would have been fun to do. And apparently that armored truck scene, the one where it's right outside the building, that one took months of negotiation with Fox to make happen. And the damage to the rails that you kind of see in the movie, still there, still very much present in at the building if you go and visit it. But, it was a brilliant decision to use this building because, one, anything that is actually real, that was really built and is around, always looks better on film than a soundstage. There's just an extra sort of quality to it. And two, because the building was still under construction, every floor kind of has its own little character. You get those great unfinished floors, the ones for McClane to run around in. They're practically movie ready. I mean, that's actual construction equipment in the background. And seeing the building's steel skeleton exposed and naked, it immediately sets those floors apart. And then, we get the executive offices. We even get this grand lobby. The environmental storytelling in the setting is almost comically absurd. I mean, the lengths that they went to incorporate kind of Japanese architecture and Japanese ideals into the Nakatomi building, this fictional building for Die Hard, it's insane. I mean, Takagi's office is obviously embellished with a plethora of Japanese motifs and artifacts. The Nakatomi logo was inspired by the helmets of samurai armor, and the reception desk, get this, is meant to suggest a Japanese military architectural technique called Oji Kobai, or fan sloping. But, my personal favorite is the atrium, where the party's at. This wasn't actually built into the building, so if you ever go on a tour there, don't expect to see it. This was actually built in Fox's Studio 15, one of Hollywood's largest studios, at least at the time. I don't know if it still is. I assume it probably still is. And if it looks a little familiar, that was completely intentional, because it's meant to invoke the implications of the Japanese buying up American industries and American culture at the time that this film was made. In this case, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. As put by Degovia in the film's audio commentary, we posited that Nakatomi Corporation bought Falling Water, disassembled it, and reassembled it in the atrium, like a trophy. Don't worry, Falling Water is still right exactly where it's supposed to be. You can still very much go visit it, and I encourage you to do so. The thing is breathtaking. And despite the fact that they seem to have blown up half of Nakatomi Plaza, or, Fox Plaza, you can still go visit that too. That's still very much still standing, still very much in use. I mean, you can go there and check it out, as some members of the press recently did, realizing a lot of it is still exactly the same. Or you can, also look for it in a few other films, including Airheads, Fight Club, Speed, No Man's Land, Lethal Weapon 2, and Tommy Boy. And I think it was in Brooklyn Nine-Nine recently. At least, Reginald VelJohnson was. McClane falling down that elevator shaft was actually a mistake. The stuntman was supposed to grab the first vent, which is what's in the script, but slipped and kept falling. They edited it so it looks like McClane grabs the next vent. Because McTiernan wanted hyper-realism for the movie, extra loud blanks were used in the guns. This not only caused Rickman to flinch every time he shot a gun, but also gave Bruce Willis permanent hearing loss in his left ear. Sam Neill, probably best known for Jurassic Park, was originally considered for Hans Gruber, but he turned the role down. Joseph Takagi has a backstory. The character, who's the senior VP of sales for Nakatomi, served in the Japanese Navy in World War II on the Akagi, which is the vault password and means Red Castle. Grand L. Bush is the one to say the line, "no relation," when the FBI agents are introduced as Johnson & Johnson, because McTiernan felt if Robert Davi said it, it'd come off as racist. It's a good point. And finally, Bruce Willis apparently had a knack for improvisation on the set, coming out with the "Hi, honey," at the end of the film, as well as a few lines in the scene where he's pulling glass out of his foot. This actually helped him net the starring role in 12 Monkeys. Before we end, before I call it quits because it's really hot in here and I need to cool off and relax and probably have a beverage, I want to cover one final thing. Is Die Hard a Christmas film? Nothing Lasts Forever could probably be considered a Christmas book, but Bruce Willis doesn't seem to think Die Hard is, based on comments he made during his Comedy Central roast.
Die Hard is not a Christmas movie.
Stephen E. D'Souza, though, he thinks it is. We've got a children's book, A Die Hard Christmas, that seems to agree, but the internet seems a little torn on it. Me? Well, let me ask you this. This goes back to what I said earlier. Is Home Alone a Christmas movie? And without going on and comparing the two, doesn't Home Alone kind of seem like the child's version of Die Hard? Doesn't Die Hard seem like the adult version of Home Alone? Well, that's my answer for you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Drunk on Writing Dissections as much as I did making it, despite this heat, this sweltering heat that is embroiling the world right now. It's hot. I'm powering through it to deliver this awesome video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you really enjoyed it, head on over to patreon.com/drunkonwriting and help support the channel. It really means a lot, and it goes a long way to bringing you all as much content as I can give you. Until next time, thank you, and, cheers, and keep on writing.